Presentation is titled Graphic Coming of Age Narratives, Contemporary Bildungsroman as Comics.
Oh, what did I do?
Oh, someone mentioned this could time out.
Oh, there we go, right? Okay, perfect. Thank you for your time. Thank you for being here. My name is Ricardo. I am an assistant professor of English at Rhode Island College. I am going to present today from a book project. I have already submitted the manuscript. It's under revision right now at the University of Arizona Press, their series on pop Latinx stuff. It should come out sometime at the end of this year or at the beginning of next year, right? And it's all about diaspora and comics, right? And this is part of a larger project that I've been doing for about 10 years that centers coming-of-age narratives. My first book with Routledge came out in 2020. It was called Children of Globalization, and it is about adapting the horizon of the expectations of the German Bildungsroman to study coming-of-age narratives that feature displacement in contemporary settings. Okay? So let's start. Comics are cool. In our expanding graphic universe, veteran comic enthusiasts and new readers not previously associated with comic consumption can find a slew of graphic stories centering the experiences of women, people of color, and queer people, tales of displacement and oppression, of material empowerment, of communities facing intersectional marginalization, often created by a likewise expanding universe of diverse authors and illustrators. An often cited article in the New York Times Magazine proposed an explanation of comic books' popularity back in 2004 when it stated that comics, quote, are what novels used to be, an accessible vernacular form with mass appeal. In stating so, McGrath enabled me to arrive at one of the key points I will make today. I don't know what's happening. Okay.
I'm going to change the setting.
Okay. That the forms of sequential art intersect and commingle with those of the Bildungsroman and its contemporary multicultural variations because they are both beloved, crowd-pleasing, exceedingly popular genres. Lest we forget Dickens, now considered highbrow, was once read in newspaper installments whose ink stained the hands of his devout readers. Coming-of-age narratives are cool too. In fact, they have enjoyed 3 centuries of enduring popularity and international acclaim. Bildungsroman scholars frequently identify the origin of the genre in the relatable growing pains of Goethe's eponymous Wilhelm Meister, a novel often identified as the first Bildungsroman. The originating and classic iteration of the broad and vernacular coming-of-age genre. Wilhelm was the first young protagonist to negotiate the opposing forces of self-determination against the demands of socialization that characterize all coming-of-age processes. Since then, the coming-of-age genre has itself come of age in variegated geographies and at the hands of multiple authors worldwide. The genre has mutated and matured at the hands of such celebrated authors as Austen, Dickens, Stendhal, Hesse, Joyce, Twain, Fitzgerald, Mann, Harper Lee, just to name a few. But it has also demonstrated its flexibility in film with such key titles as Cinema Paradiso, Boyhood, Moonlight, and Lady Bird. It is ubiquitous in animated feature films, including, for example, many of the formative stories produced by Disney, DreamWorks, Pixar, and Studio Ghibli. Most importantly, for this presentation, coming-of-age stories have thrived as graphic and sequential narratives. Coming-of-age narratives, malleable since their origins in the 18th century German iterations of the Bildungsroman, often overlap with the sister genres of memoir, biography, testimonio, and the picaresque. For long-time readers of graphic novels and serialized comics, the assertion that the coming-of-age genre frequently takes the form of graphic narratives should not come as a surprise. To name a few, there's Sartrapi's Persepolis, Bechdel's Phone Home, and Lueng Yang's American-Born Chinese. The visual language of graphic narratives enables a grammar of character development unique to the medium, whereby characters' growth can be depicted with the complexity of line work, the deliberate use of shadows, light, color palettes, and medium-specific rhetorical devices, such as bleeds and pioneering uses of the gutter. In the context of diasporic narratives, graphic narratives can depict the trauma of displacement and marginalization where words fail. Like cherished classic coming-of-age novels, graphic narratives constitute a treasured genre with characters that transcend the paper and become friends, especially to young readers growing up alongside the likes of Lizzie Bennet, Pip, Tom Sawyer, Margie Satrapi, and Peter Parker. The coming-of-age genre has persisted precisely because it teaches younger readers how to negotiate their passage into adulthood, what reaching maturity means, to understand themselves, their desires, and dreams. Coming-of-age narratives remind adult readers that, despite our age, we are also always in a process of understanding ourselves and who we want to become. Our sociocultural identities are in a perpetual state of flux and negotiation. Coming-of-age narratives remind all readers that, regardless of the stage of life, we are constantly beginning new paths, new ways of thinking, new jobs, new roles in our families, new ways of existing politically, socially, culturally. Rather than passively being in the world, we are relentlessly becoming. When Karl Morgenstern coined the term Bildungsroman in the 1820s, he did so in specific reference to Goethe's novel. Morgenstern argued for this term first because the subject matter of these stories is the Bildung of the protagonist. Yet, rather than using the word protagonist, Morgenstern foregrounds the heroic nature of the young man by using the word Held. At this stage of the development of the genre, young man is correct, since Morgenstern deliberately uses the masculine form, and the hero Wilhelm is a white, European, enlightened, heterosexual, cisgender, affluent youth. Second, because the formation of the hero has, or at least should have in Morgenstern's view, a didactic effect on the formation of the imagined male, white, enlightened, and affluent reader. In this sense, the originating Bildungsroman produces an accommodated hero, representative of some of the most conservative values of a specific sociocultural context, whom the equally normative readers out to imitate. To illustrate how difficult it is to taxonomize the Bildungsroman, one needs only to review some of the narrowest definitions. Thomas Mann argued that the genre is a variety of the novel that is German, typically German, legitimately national. François Jost argues that even a novel as widely accepted as a Bildungsroman as Charles Dickens' David Copperfield should not be considered as such because it expands too many decades and includes childhood, whereas Wilhelm Meister is strictly about adolescence. In his words, David Copperfield is not Wilhelm Meister. The former quenches his thirst with milk, the latter with wine. And while I have put forth the case that Wilhelm Meister is the prototype and Urtext, others make the claim that the claim for Geschichte des Agathon by Christoph Martin Wieland. Regardless of whether one takes Wilhelm Meister or Geschichte des Agathon as Urtext, the line of argumentation that centers either of these novels grounds the preoccupation of the self in the German Enlightenment. The heroic bravery to be a rational being and, in the process, know oneself is clearly illustrated in the work of German philosophers Herder and Kant. In On the Cognition and Sensation of the Human Soul, Herder defended the quest for self-formation, which requires from the individual, quote, the integrity and faithfulness to sketch himself fully as he knows and feels himself. And, quote, enough courage to look into the deep abyss of Platonic recollection and to suppress nothing to himself. Enough courage to pursue himself through his whole living structure, through his whole life, with everything that each index finger points out to him in his inner eye. To provide a visual representation of such heroic bravery, Caspar David Friedrich's 1818 painting, Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog, which is depicted here, is often cited as the enlightened individual, the hero of the Bildungsroman, overlooking a world of mist and shadows that at once represents ignorance of unexplored geographies, but also of one's own undiscovered self. In recent decolonial readings, Friedrich's man indicates a European colonial desire for command over the savagery of unconquered lands. As Smith argues, the image allures to mastery of the scene beheld. To imagine the hero of the originating Bildungsroman as exclusively the man from Friedrich's canvas runs the danger of excluding all experiences that are not affluent, male, white, and in short, hegemonic from the genre, and thus a more open definition is required if we're to analyze graphic narratives as coming-of-age novels. My own definition of coming-of-age narratives centers questions about what youth means and the process by which all types of people wrestle with the expectations of maturity. This definition is shown over there. A beginner goes through an internal formative process that ends not with a sense of optimistic accomplishment, but with an individual notion of adulthood, which is the result of the internal process of development and foregrounds complexity and nuance, especially in the face of stereotypes. I use the term beginner instead of youth or young person, first to avoid the ageist language that pervades scholarly literature on the coming-of-age genre, and second, to emphasize the argument that coming-of-age narratives can happen at different stages of life. But what about graphic coming-of-age novels? What is so distinct about graphic coming-of-age novels is the language of abstraction that is used to represent experiences of identity development. Academic literature on the subject of graphic COA novels frequently repeats the same three examples of works that fit into the taxonomy, all worthy of close analysis for their astonishing aesthetic achievements alone. Satrapi's Persepolis, Luen Yang's American-Born Chinese, and Tamaki's Skin. There are myriad possibilities that the language of graphic narratives brings to coming-of-age stories. Ian Gordon's pioneering study, Bildungsroman and Graphic Narratives, explores many of them, suggesting that graphic narratives offer, quote, a form of Bildungsroman in which process is more important than closure, thus challenging the key narrative epiphanies that characterize the optimistic and idealized adulthoods of the most classic Bildungsroman. Gordon's foregrounding of process coincides with Stuart Hall's notion of identity as, quote, a production, which is never complete, always in process, and which characterizes the type of identity in flux most often present at the end of diasporic coming-of-age novels. In addition to highlighting process, Gordon notes that the graphic coming-of-age genre is currently drawing scholarly attention because it has had a recent boom in popularity. The interest in comics as a form of Bildungsroman stems from a wave of graphic novels published in increasing numbers since the success of Spiegelman's Maus. Gordon advocates for reading Maus as well as Yang's American-Born Chinese, Pat Grant's Blue, and Bechdel's Phone Home as coming-of-age stories because they all feature the process of gathering the maturity gained in a Bildungsroman, not only through the experience but also the reflection on that experience. Gordon argues about Phone Home that at a meta level, Phone Home is Bechdel's meditation on reaching maturity and, like Maus, the act of creating the work, at least in the way this act of creation is represented in the book, is the moment of realizing the maturation, the passage to which the book traces. Moreover, studies in the overlap of the coming-of-age genre and graphic novels suggest that beyond recent entanglements, the importance of memory, key to understanding oneself in all coming-of-age novels as a result of experiences and the lessons that are derived from them, is even more conspicuous in the pictorial form of sequential art. Comics are almost always about memory, about looking back, about making sense of the past. Pat Grant, the author of Blue, adds, quote, it may be that all storytelling is about memory to some extent, but cartooning seems more powerfully linked to juvenile vocabularies of being and knowing than other kinds of writing, sinking into the story space that comic art affords us as cartoonists, but also as readers, is to step back into an adolescent or pre-adolescent state by bypassing the analytical and historical filters with which we, as adults, process sensory data. This leaves us exposed to raw, emotive readings of time, space, and form. Comic art seems to be the key that many people need to access a chamber of their psyche that is otherwise locked away from the adult consciousness. As Gordon notes, Grant goes as far as to argue that the history of sequential art, quote, consists of 1,000 coming-of-age narratives tangled up together in an unruly lump. In terms of the representation of diaspora, the graphic coming-of-age novel can render the contrast of past and present visually, foregrounding memory in the present moment with the tool of images within images. It can also show the ugliness of stereotypes, discrimination, and marginalization. As an example of this ugliness, Gordon cites the character of Chinky in American-Born Chinese, where the illustrator deploys a bucktooth, queue-wearing stereotype depiction of a Chinese. Chin-Ki to unsettle his Americanized character, Danny. The denouncement of the violence of stereotype, Gordon states, quote, is something that could only be done visually. Graphic narratives enable the readers to ask what pictorial language allows in the representation of diasporic coming-of-age formative processes that would otherwise be impossible to portray, in reference to the traumas of mobility, identity negotiation, cultural shock, and other related experiences of alterity in diaspora. Hussein and Jha argue that, quote, comics become a potential medium of expression of trauma because instead of shying away from it, they take the risk of representation, made possible because of the highly participatory and active medium of comics. I would like to end this presentation by showing an example of the unique power of comics to depict character growth in its own grammar. In Gaby Rivera's and Celia Moscote's 2020 graphic novel, Juliet Takes a Breath, Moscote uses the size of the main character, Juliet, in relation to the panel and to other characters, to show her identity development and passage into adulthood. At the beginning of the novel, 3 boys harass Juliet in a supermarket in the Bronx. 2 of them are faceless, thus representing a form of male violence that is not person-specific, but is rather exercised by men of color in Juliet's community. Their faceless depiction reminds readers of images of ghosts, fictional specters, whose gender-based violence is very real. The ringleader, the only boy with a face, is so disproportionately large in the panel in relation to tiny Juliet, the reader cannot help but empathize with the magnitude of the threat and how small violent harassment makes Juliet feel. This device of exaggerated size difference repeats throughout the graphic narrative, showing in visual metaphorical terms how Juliet feels, especially in terms of confidence and control. Because certainly, Juliet is not really growing or shrinking in relation to her environment. A contrasting episode comes immediately afterwards when Juliet comes out as a lesbian to her family, becoming huge in the panel, occupying the whole page with her body and, with the device of a picture within the picture, slamming her oversized hand on the table. The device of size disparity is finally repeated when, in Portland, Juliet meets her second partner of the novel, Kira, a half-white, half-Korean intern working at a public library. However, despite Juliet appearing small in comparison to Kira, the size disparity expresses shyness mixed with desire, rather than the powerlessness of the scene in the Bronx. The COA genre, the coming-of-age genre, either graphic or as plain text, continues to grow and transform as much as its protagonists. It represents people in the mainstream and at the margins of our increasingly interconnected world. The graphic narratives that will appear in the volume that I was telling you about are first and foremost for readers who are outcasts themselves. And it is not that we cannot feel empathy for the likes of Wilhelm Meister or Peep or Lizzie Bennett or Julian Sorel, but we also want to see our own graphic stories elevated to the status of great Bildungsromane. As Nobel laureate Toni Morrison luminously articulated it, I want to read, quote, village literature, fiction that is reality for the village, for the tribe, peasant literature for my people, which is necessary and legitimate. Thank you.
Violence and youth resistance in Agosto